Australians.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you. Every time you see a wind turbine or an industrial solar complex, think one thing: your energy prices are going to increase. That's what they mean. We've been promised they will decrease, but wind turbines and industrial solar complexes mean higher prices for people, for families, for small businesses, for larger corporations and employers, for the whole community. And they mean trillions of dollars in waste in our economy. Every country around the world, as the percentage of solar and wind has increased, the cost of electricity has increased. Fact. Everywhere. Consistent. And now we see the ridiculous situation after nearly 30 years of pushing solar and wind that started with John Howard's renewable energy target. We see the Labor government offering energy price relief. Why? Because they're driving up the cost of energy to make it unaffordable. That's why. So let's have a look at why. Let's see why killing the environment in the name of supposedly saving it is costing us so much. Let's turn to the terms of reference of the inquiry motion. So many people want us to have an inquiry, and not just rural people, urban people, because they're worried about the costs. Here we are. This is what the inquiry is looking into. The importance of ensuring the national electricity grid has the capacity to provide a reliable and secure supply of energy to Australians. Secondly, as the economy transitions to new and more dispersed, and we'll talk about that, methods of generation and storage, and acknowledging that transition will necessarily transgress on agricultural, indigenous and environmental lands and marine environments. The environment and our productive capacity is suffering. I'll cover some key concerns that are key to the inquiry, because the Uni Party has not thought about this. Right from when John Howard, the Liberal Prime Minister, started the renewable energy target, now to this ridiculous situation we're in now. And by the way, John Howard started that and did three other things which we might have time to discuss that lay the foundation for the crippling of our energy supply in this country. And 6 years after he was booted from office, he admitted that on the matter of climate science, he is agnostic. He didn't have the science. His whole thing is based not on science. It's based on contradictions of science. Now let's start with solar and wind. The tonnes of steel needed per megawatt of electricity from coal-fired power station is 35. From wind turbines is 542 tonnes of steel. 15 times as much. So straight away, wind is suffering a cost penalty, a huge cost burden. And then when you look at the energy density of coal, it's very high. Not as high as uranium, but very high. Solar and wind, very low. Secondly, I see the government throwing barbs at the coalition, and well, it should over aspects of its nuclear policy, but the opposition is accusing the government of being the government is accusing the opposition of uncosted policy. Where are your costs, government? Where are your costs on solar and wind? Where are your costs on solar and wind, Greens? We even see some solar and wind complexes, massive complexes in the Kennedy electorate in North and Western Queensland, Western Victoria, not connected to the grid, built but not connected. That's how much thought's gone into this. It's bloody ridiculous. Solar and wind have an inherently high capital cost plus a low energy density, which means low energy production and very high unit cost per unit of electricity. Plus the amount of land needed for solar and wind is enormous. And then we see that the average capacity utilisation of solar and wind is 23%, less than a quarter of what the nameplate capacity is. And now we see the latest figures just released on wind, 21%, 1/5 of the capacity. What does that tell you? For a given capacity of a coal-fired power station, you'll need a certain capacity of solar and wind. Multiply that by 4, because you're getting less than 25%. Multiply it by 5 in the case of wind. 5 times makes it prohibitive. 4 times makes it prohibitive. And then think about this. At peak hour, when we need maximum electricity, the average utilisation, the average capacity is 10%, which means to get the equivalent of that coal-fired power station, we need 10 times the solar and wind capacity, 10 times. And then, for sizable periods, we have the sun not shining brightly because of clouds, or we have the wind drought. That means we need a further multiplication to make sure we can store up enough in energy and batteries. But the batteries to store that amount of wind and solar energy have never been thought of, never been considered, never been developed. Impossible. The cost, if we don't have them, will be blackouts, outages in hospitals, businesses, family homes. Plus the transmission costs. Transmission costs used to be, many years ago, 49% of the cost of electricity bill. I don't know what it is now, but it's certainly substantial. Solar and wind have to be located a long way from the major metropolitan areas, which means straight away transmission costs are even higher than for a coal-fired power station, which can be located close to the metropolitan areas. And then, because of the dispersed nature of solar and wind, we have even more transmission lines. And then, because of the capacity factor that I just mentioned, we have even more transmission lines. This makes it prohibitive, not just in terms of the installation of solar and wind, but also in terms of transmission lines. Plus, the transmission lines will barely be used because of the capacity of solar and wind not being utilised, not possibly being utilised. And then we have the 15 to 20-year life, if best, 12 to 15 years more likely, of solar and wind industrial complexes. 12 to 15 years, which means over the life of a coal-fired power station or a nuclear power station, they have to be replaced 4 times. So multiply the cost again by 4. So what have we multiplied it by so far? We've multiplied the cost by 5, then by 10, and now by another 4. That's what is considered. Yet the CSIRO considers not one piece of that puzzle, not one piece. They just ignore it. They say it's all sunk costs, ignore it. That's why solar and wind can compete. And they still need subsidies. They still need subsidies. Then you've got to add batteries and pumped hydro. Pumped hydro itself is an admission of failure. It's an admission of failure. You cannot have pumped hydro without a disparity between peak hour prices and off-peak prices. And that's due to the failure of the grid and solar and wind. And then we need firming. Here's another cost, because coal, nuclear and hydro are stable, synchronous power supplies. Solar and wind are asynchronous, unstable, and so they need firming. And they need backup gas because solar and wind are unreliable, or backup coal because solar and wind are unreliable. There's a doubling. So look at the multiplication that we've got there. None of this, as I said, is included in gen cost from the CSIRO. It assumes no transmission costs because they've already been built. That's rubbish, because we cannot use, we need far more new transmission lines. So we've got an inherently higher cost from solar and wind, plus low capacity, plus regional, plus dispersal, plus backup, plus stabilisation. And think about this. For a business, you need a stable input, reliable input, low variation input. When variation occurs, it costs enormous amounts of money. So industrial plants, manufacturing plants, farmers are using backup, so they've got to pay twice for their electricity. And then we have a huge footprint in terms of land. Solar complexes, wind turbines use far more land, and it's far more scattered than a concentrated coal-fired power station or nuclear power station. They're taking up our resources, huge quantities of resources. The resource footprint of solar and wind is enormous. And then we've got agricultural land being sterilised. And we've got poisons and toxins going potentially into the Brisbane water supply, which feeds Brisbane, Beaudesert, Gold Coast, potentially Toowoomba, Ipswich, Logan, and other areas in the southeast of Queensland, all going into their drinking water. Lead, cadmium. And then we've got the future cost yet to be added. Snowy 2. Oh, and by the way, when they first did the costings of Snowy 2, thanks to Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership and poor leadership, they forgot about the transmission lines. They forgot to add the transmission lines. Whoops! Whoops! We better add a few more billion to that. And now look at it. Originally slated for $2 billion. We could see this, and I'm not an energy expert. We could see it when Malcolm Turnbull first released it. And we told them, and no one took any notice. Now they're putting all these additional costs, and Snowy 2 is heading now for $14 billion, perhaps $20 billion. If it moves. If it moves. So this is not about having an alternative energy supply. It's about less energy and it's about control of energy. And then we have Mr Albanese and Mr Bowen, Blackhat Bowen is, as he's nicknamed sometimes, but Mr Bowen, talking about us being a renewable superpower, superpower. It means economic and environmental suicide, resource sterilisation, displacement of Indigenous. No costings, a huge catastrophe. We're talking about billions of dollars and impacts worth trillions of dollars. We must have this inquiry. They're building in a high-cost overhead and a huge environmental legacy. When some of those farmers who are looking at the money now, some aren't selling out, but some are selling out because of the money coming in. Think about the environmental legacy. No bonds. The energy company owning the wind turbines and the solar complexes, just walk off and leave it. Just leave it. No requirement to fix it. The farmers will be paying for that. They're already paying in many cases, as are rural towns, with the slow thrum, thrum, thrum of infrasound, which is harmful to humans, proven harmful to humans. So they're killing the environment to save it. We're seeing human progress being reversed. The number one message from the last 170 years since the Industrial Revolution started was that we've had a higher standard of living and all the benefits that bring because of a relentless reduction in energy prices. What we've seen since John Howard came to power is a reversal of that. And as energy prices increase, productivity falls, wealth falls, prosperity falls. So we see a reversal of human progress. So what if we spend billions on solar and wind? What about if it costs our economy trillions of dollars? And it will. And what about if China does not? What happens then? Now do you get what's going on? Now do you see it? I want to turn to two other points. As I said, John Howard introduced all the problems we're seeing now. Renewable energy target, the stealing of farmers' property rights to comply with the UN Kyoto Protocol, the national electricity market, which is really a national electricity racket, and he also introduced an emissions trading scheme as policy, not as fact but as policy. That's a carbon tax. He was the first of a major leader of a major party to have that. The CSIRO has never provided any empirical scientific data in logical scientific points that prove the need to cut carbon dioxide from human activity. The CSIRO has admitted to me when I held it accountable, and it gave me 3 presentations, each 2.5 hours long. First presentation, it admitted that it had never given the advice and has never said that carbon dioxide from human activity is a problem, is a danger and needs to be cut. Carbon dioxide from human activity they've never said it's a danger and needs to be cut. Second presentation they gave me, they admitted that today's temperatures are not unprecedented. Not unprecedented. Happened before, many, many times. And in fact, the scientific term for periods of high temperature are climate optimums, because they're beneficial for humanity, they're beneficial for civilization, they're beneficial for the environment. Temperature is not unprecedented. The second thing is, I've asked many government departments in this country, in this federal government, for their basis of policy. To have a basis for policy, you need to have the impact of carbon dioxide from human activity on some climate factor. No one has given us that. We have amassed 24,000 data sets on climate and energy from around the world, legally scraped websites, research institutions, CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, never found any change in any climate factor at all. So there's no basis for policy, and then you need that quantitative amount of impact of carbon dioxide from human activity on a climate factor so that you can then study the alternatives if you want to get rid of the carbon dioxide production. And you've got to have that to track progress. Well, there's none of that. There's no basis for policy. We are flying blind, we're heading for a cliff, and then we see there's no environmental impact statement for the use of solar and wind. None at all. So the energy we're taking out of the wind, what is that going to have on our climate? What impact is that going to have on the natural environment? Yet they say 0.03% of the carbon dioxide is coming from humans. 1.2% of that from Australians. No impact quantified. The absurdity is enormous. And who will pay for all this mess? We, the people. You are foisting this on the people. We need an inquiry now.